Hey folks, welcome back, and today in lecture we are going to talk more about if statements and conditionals in general. So in the last lecture we did an introduction to conditionals, and today we're going to continue and look at some more advanced examples of conditionals. So as we said, a conditional starts with the word if, and then there's going to be a set of parentheses, and inside those parentheses there is a Boolean condition that must evaluate to either true or false. If it's true, then it's going to do the block of statements that are enclosed in the curly braces underneath the if. If you have an else condition and the original condition was false, then it'll execute the block of statements in the curly braces below the else condition. All right, so this brings us to the question of, well, what happens if you have more than two choices? So the common situation with an if statement is you say, if the GPA is above a certain number, then do one thing. If it's below that number, then do something else. But the world isn't always binary like that. Sometimes you need to check 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 things. And so let's take the example of a restaurant that might have 3 drink choices, small, medium, and large. So if you were writing some code to dispense the liquids into the drink cups, you'd have to know whether it's a small cup, a medium cup, or a large cup to know how much liquid to drop in there. And so that's a case where you'd have 3 choices, because small, medium, and large. So let's take a look at the flow of a if statement. And this is what we're going to be dealing with today. So an if statement allows you to check more than one condition. So we would start off at the top, and that's where we have this word condition up there. And the condition is then checked. And if the condition is true, we do the statement block that's associated with the if. If it's not true, then we move on and we check the second condition. And if that's true, we do that block. If not, we check the third condition, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on, depending on how many we may have. There may also be, finally, an else statement at the end if you're doing an if, else. All right, so let's take a look at this example. So what we want to do is we want to ask the user if they want a small, a medium, or a large, and then we're going to print out how much liquid we're going to pour into the cup. And here we hopefully have a replit where we're going to be able to code here in just a moment. Okay, there we go. All right, so we're going to first ask the user what type of, or what size drink. And we're going to say that the choices are small, medium, or large. All right, so as usual, it's important that you tell the user what it is that you are expecting them to do, because if you don't tell them that, they're not going to know what the system is waiting for. All right, so we're going to want to read in their answer, and we're going to read it in as a string because they're either going to type the word small, the word medium, or the word large. So I'm going to need a scanner. And we're going to need to import Java util scanner as usual up at the top. All right. Okay, so now that we have done that, we should be able to read in their choice. So I'm going to store that in a string, and I'm going to call it drink size. And we're going to store in their myscan.next line. All right, so we're assuming that the user is going to type in small, medium, or large. So what we're now going to do is we're going to have an if statement. We're going to say if the drink size dot equals, and remember when you're doing a string compare, you're going to use a dot equals, not a equal equal. So if it's equal to small, then we're going to say, and I'm going to store a variable up here, which is number of ounces. All right, so in the case of small, I'm going to say the number of ounces is 8. It's a very small drink, apparently. All right, so if it's not small, then the next thing we're going to check for is if the drink size is equal to medium. And in that case, the number of ounces is going to be 16. And finally, in all other cases, I'm going to assume that they have a large because we've already covered small and we've covered medium. So in this case, num ounces is going to be 22. And then at the end, I'm just going to print out all right. And so let's run this guy and let's see what we get. So it asks me to type in small, medium, or large. And I'm going to type in medium. And with any bit of luck, it's going to tell me that my drink is 16 ounces. All right, now I can immediately say I made a mistake there. When I asked them to type it in, I typed mead or med, but then I checked to see if it's actually the word medium. So just to make that consistent, I'm going to make that consistent. All right, and indeed it says you bought a 16-ounce drink, which is right. All right, so we're going to run it again, and this time I'm going to type in large. And we should hopefully see that I get a 22-ounce drink this time. And indeed I do. Now, there's a couple of things to notice that I did here. So the first one is, this is not an else if, it's just an else. So effectively what I'm doing is I'm checking if they gave me the word small, or if they gave me the word medium, but then for all other cases, I assume that they're getting a large drink. And one weird side effect of this is, remember that string compares are going to match exactly what's in parentheses. So if I don't match this exactly, like if I type in small with a lowercase s, then I'm actually going to get a 22-ounce drink because lowercase small doesn't match this and it doesn't match that, so we're going to fall through to the else, which is maybe not ideal. This probably should be equals ignore case, because then it will work whether I do uppercase or lowercase, and the same would be true here. And that would at least make that a little bit better. And you might also really want to check for mead or medium or misspellings of the words even. So you might actually want a bunch of ors on each of those if the drink size is equal to small, or the drink size is equal to SAMLL or SMAL or SM, or whatever combinations you might want to allow them to type in. All right, so that's a pretty basic program, but that uses a if, else, which is our new construction that we've seen here. This else if condition is effectively the new part. We've seen an if and we've seen an else. Now we're just adding else ifs in the middle. And this allows you to have as many of those as you want. So the cool part about an else if condition is that it checks to see many different circumstances. And here we have pretty much the same code that I just wrote, with the scanner, and then asking which drink it is, reading it in, and then deciding on how many ounces that they're getting. Okay, well, I think I did 16, 22, and 32 this time. All right. So overall, an if statement can have one or as many else ifs as you want in there. There can be zero, we've certainly seen that, but you can also have one else if, two else ifs, three else ifs, four else ifs. You could have 99 else ifs inside of a single if statement. And then you can also have 0 or 1 else statements. And what that means is the else statement is optional. There's no rule that says you always have to have an else statement. Having an else if does not necessitate that you have an else. They are completely independent. So you could have an if statement that just has an if statement. You could have an if statement that also has an else. You could have an if statement that has one else if and doesn't have an else, and another one that has one else if and does have an else. One else if, two else ifs, three else ifs. So you can have any number of different combinations there for an if statement. I will point out here, though, either block 1, block 2, block 3, or block 4 will guaranteeably happen in this statement, and only one of them will happen. So if A, whatever A is true, then you get block 1. If B is true, you get block 2. If C is true, you get block 3. And in all other cases, you're going to get block 4 because it's an else. So it's important to notice that in this construction with an if, else, one and only one of these will execute. All right, and so that brings us to a different version where we have an if with a bunch of else ifs. And the way I would phrase this is, you may run block 1, block 2, or block 3, or you may run nothing. The difference between this is that there's no else. Because there's just if, else if, else if, each of those has to be evaluated, and if they are true, then we get the block, but if they're not true, then nothing happens because there's no else condition down at the bottom here. So it is possible that this results in nothing. All right, so we're going to write a couple of examples. Write a full program which prompts the user for their grade. Tell the user if they have an A, a B, a C, a D, or an F in the class. All right, so we're going to go back over to our replit window here, and we're going to make a new replit, and we're going to check to see what the letter grade is for each of the students. So let's talk through how you calculate this. So if a student has an 89.5 or higher, then we would generally say that that student is getting an A. If it's a 79.5 or higher, then they got a B, and so on and so forth. So what we're going to do is we're going to use an if, else if condition, and we're going to have an else at the bottom that's going to deal with the F case, which is that they have anything other than what we just described, and then we're going to print out their answer. So again, we're going to need a scanner. So we're going to import Java util scanner, and we're going to make the scanner object like we always do here. So I'm just going to do scanner myscan equals new scanner system.in, and then we are going to ask them to enter in their grade. All right, and since grades can have decimal points in them, I'm going to store that in a float. So I'm going to say float grade equals myscan.next float. Because remember, you can read in a float or an int or whatever you need. All right, so now that I have that read in, I'm going to use an if statement. So if the grade is greater than or equal to 89.5, then you get an A. All right, so that checks for the case where they get an A. We're just going to run it as is, because you can certainly run an if statement without an else. And we're just going to check if I type in a grade of like 92, does it say that they get an A? Hopefully it does. And then we're going to check it again, and we're going to give them a grade of less than 89.5 and see what happens. So 92, they got an A, looks good. Running it again, and this time I'm going to type in a grade of 57, and hopefully they don't get an A. I mean, it would be great if we gave everybody an A, but that's not how the world works, I'm afraid. So, all right, 57. Yep, it does nothing. Great. So now we're going to use our else ifs to deal with the other conditions. So else if grade is greater than or equal to 79.5, then you get a B. Now, you might say, but don't I also have to check that it's less than 89.5 in this circumstance? And the answer is no. The way an if statement works is if this is true, if they have a grade that is greater than 89.5, it's going to do this statement and then it's done. It doesn't look at any of the other else ifs, it doesn't look at the else, it just moves on to the bottom past the end of the if statement, which would be right here, right now. So if the grade is greater than 89.8, it does this and then it's done. If it has even checked this condition, then we know that they weren't greater than 89.5 just by virtue of the fact that they got here, because they wouldn't have got here if it was greater than 89.5 or greater than or equal to. So in reality, what this condition is checking is that it's greater than 79.5 and less than 89.5. All right, and so that gives them a B. And then we need other else ifs. So same logic here. If their grade is greater than or equal to 69.5, then they get a C. And if another else if here, their grade is greater than or equal to 59.5, they get a D. Okay, so that takes care of the first A, B, C, and D. Now, the way that it works is in all other conditions, they're going to get an F. Because, again, if it wasn't greater than 89, and it wasn't greater than 79, and it wasn't greater than 69, and it wasn't greater than 59, then by definition, they have a grade that is lower than 59.5, and that is an F. So I don't need another else if, I just need an else. So I'm going to say else system.out.println, you get an F. All right, so let's run this guy. And the reason I don't need that else if here is because, again, it wouldn't have gotten to this point if it were not for the fact that their grade is lower than 59.5. So let's say they got a 72. Looks like they have a C. That seems reasonable. Let's run it again, and let's see if they have a 52. We would expect that they will get an F from that case. And indeed we do. So I'm just going to trace through this and show you how this worked. The way it worked is it started off looking at this if statement, and it said, is 52 greater than or equal to 89.5? And it's not. So since that's false, it moved on to the next statement. And then it said, if 52 is greater than or equal to 79.5, which it's not, so it moved on to the next statement. If 52 is greater than or equal to 69.5, which it is not, if the grade is greater than or equal to 59.5, which it is not, and then when it got to the else, it said, okay, we're going to do the else, because that's the only choice left. So that's how you would write a longer if, else if, and in this case it even has an else, in order to get a letter grade from a number grade. And so that code, or at least very similar code to what I just wrote, is here in the next slide for you to review in case you need to come back and do it again. So that's pretty much what I just wrote. All right, so a couple of things to notice. The order of those statements is very important. You could do it exactly the opposite way, and you could say if their grade is less than 69.5, they get an F. If it's less than 79.5, they get a D. If it's less than 89.5, they get a C. If it's less than 90, or whatever. You could do it in reverse. If you're going to do that, that works fine, but you can't do it in some random order where you check the F first and then check the B and then check the C, because if you did that, you'd have to be more explicit with the if statement. You'd have to say if it's specifically between these two numbers in order to check that. The fact that I'm doing them in order means that I don't have to do those longer conditionals. So what I mean by that is, let's imagine that we first check that their grade is greater than or equal to 89.5, which is what I did, and that covers the A condition. But if I now were to go on and do the C condition, because the only thing I've so far checked is the A condition, in order to check the C condition, what I would have to do is say, if the grade is greater than or equal to 69.5, and it is less than 79.5. Because if I don't put the and less than 79.5, it's going to assume that everybody got a C, even when they maybe got a B. So the order was important in the way that I did that. And generally, when you're doing big, long if-else-ifs, you're going to want to check things in a particular order that makes sense. The other thing that you notice is that on that last statement, I didn't have to say this. I didn't say else if grade is less than 59.5. And again, the reason for that is because if you got to that statement, by definition, the grade is less than 59.5. Now, people sometimes ask, well, could you put that in there? Could you make that an else if, and would the code work the same? And the answer is yes. The code would work exactly the same if you had put in else if grade is less than 59.5 instead of just that last else. The only real downside to doing that is it's more code, and you might make a mistake on exactly how you're doing that boundary. And for example, the most common mistake people would make is they would say if it's less than or equal to 59.5, or in the previous one they would say less than 59, greater than 59.5. And the equals is an important number. What happens if they got a 59.50 exactly? Then they still need to get their D, in that case, not an F. So you just need to be careful as you write these statements that you are writing them correctly. And if you can avoid writing an extra statement, you should do it. Simpler code is almost always best. So if you have an option to not do an else if, it's better by some small margin to not do it because there's less code and less complication. All right, so a very common thing that you'll want to do in your code is to present the user, the person using your code, with a menu of choices. And so you'll often see this in programs where it'll say if you'd like to do X, press 1. If you'd like to do something else, press 2. You also get this when you call somebody like a support group. They'll usually have a call tree where they'll ask you to press 1 if you want to talk about your bill, press 2 if you want to add service, press 3 if you want to cancel service, etc., etc. So it's presenting you with a menu and allowing you to choose from those menus. This is a great way of getting the user to give you information in a consistent way. The problem with my last example, where we were doing the drink sizes, is, do you want small, medium, or large? And it's quite obvious that some people are going to mistype medium, or some people are going to mistype large. So maybe a better option would be, instead of just asking them to type in the word small, medium, or large, make 1 equal to small, 2 equal to medium, and 3 equal to large, and give it to them as a menu. And then they're just typing in a number, which is easier for them to do. And so, like in this example, we're asking, what grade are you? And their choices are freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. And they're just typing in 1 for freshman, 2 for sophomore, 3 for junior, etc. All right, so the way that this will generally work is, first you'll have to print out all of the different options that you want the user to choose from. So you're going to have a bunch of print statements, and then you're going to read the user's response in and store it in an integer. You should call that variable something that's related to the choices. So if you're asking about grade, it should probably be grade number or something like that. And then usually you'll have an if-else-if block to process the user's choice. All right, so here's another example. So we're going to allow the user to choose what kind of drink they want. And so, we have a scanner, and we create a scanner object, and then we have a bunch of print statements. What drink do you want? 1 for Coke, 2 for Coke Zero, 3 for Fanta, 4 for Sprite. 3 for Sprite, 4 for Fanta. And then we read in the particular number that they want. So notice that down here, what I'm doing is I'm using a variable which is of an integer type, calling it drink, and I'm reading in a number. I'm not reading in a word or a line, I'm just reading in a number. And that number is then getting stored in drink. So at the end of this, I have a variable called drink, which has either 1, 2, 3, or 4 in it, ideally. All right, so then we're going to have an if statement where we're going to process that. And so the first one is going to be an if. We're going to check if the drink is equal to 1. Notice these are two equals because I'm comparing something. So drink equal 1. And then I'm printing out, okay, you're getting a Coke. And I do whatever code I need to do to dispense an actual Coke. And then I have an else if statement where I'm dealing with the case of drink equals 2. And in that case, they're getting a Coke Zero. And then another else if statement that deals with case 3. And then finally another else if statement that deals with case 4. Now you could certainly argue about this last else if statement. Does this really need to be an else if, or do you just get Fanta by default? What happens if the user types in 0? What happens if the user types in 7? Well, as the code currently works, they get nothing. But if you change this last statement to just else, meaning I just cross out this one bit right here, then all of a sudden, what happens is you get Fanta by default. If they type in 0, 7, 992, they get Fanta. Basically, anything that is not 1, 2, or 3 would give them Fanta. But as it's written right now, it's specifically checking if they gave a 4, and it does nothing else for any other condition. And just depends on what it is that you are trying to do as to whether that is correct or not. All right. So that brings us to multiple if statements. Each individual if statement can detect one thing, and you can either do code based on it or not based on it if you have an else at the end. So check a condition, and then if the condition is true, you do one thing. If the condition is not true, you do something else if there's an else. But it's also possible that you might need to check two different things that are unrelated. If the sun is out and it is a weekday, then you need to put on clothes and go to class. If the sun is not out and it's not a weekday, okay, that's probably not a great example. Don't come to class naked. So this is a way of checking multiple things that are not directly related to each other. And so if you want to do that, you would need two separate if statements. You'll also find that there are circumstances where you only want to check one thing if something else is true. So if it is, and in that example, you might argue that those two things are related. You only want to get up and go to class if it is a weekday and you have class that day. Those are two separate things, but they're directly related. And so that might be two if statements that might be nested. All right, so we're going to take a look at a few different examples here. So the first one is we're going to look at whether or not the user is a freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior. And then we're going to ask them for their GPA. And then we're going to do two completely independent things. If their GPA is below 2.5, we're going to tell them that they need some improvement. If they're a freshman or sophomore, we're going to welcome them and tell them that they'll be with us for a while. But if they're a junior or senior, we're going to tell them to hang in there because they're almost done. All right, so there's no relationship between these two things. We're just asking their GPA and we're asking how long they have left in college, basically. All right, so let's go ahead and code this one up. So what we're going to do first is the usual. We're going to make our scanner objects, and we're going to prompt the user with a menu, and we're going to read in their answers. Okay, so we're going to start off and we're going to ask, are you a freshman? All right, and in order for this to work, I'm going to again need a scanner, as I always do. And so we're going to import scanner and all that good stuff up here. Cannot type today. All right, and scanner, my scan equals new scanner, system.in. All right, so it looks like we're just going to read this in as a string. So the user is going to type in one of those four things for me. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a string, and we're going to call it class. We're going to call it class answer. All right, class is a reserved word. You notice that when I typed in the word class, it turned purple in here, and that's because that's already a word, and you can see up at the top we say class main as part of the skeleton. So you can't call a variable class, so I'm going to call it class answer. And we're reading in myscan.nextLine. All right, then I'm supposed to ask them for their GPA. What is your GPA? And again, we're going to store this one in a float. GPA is equal to myscan.nextFloat. All right, so we've asked the user for the two different things. Now we're going to process each of them. So if the GPA is less than 2.5, then we're going to say you could use some improvement. All right, and this is basically a if statement. It doesn't have an else. I'm not doing anything else if they are greater than 2.5 or greater than or equal to 2.5. Only in the condition that they are less than 2.5 am I going to do this. I see a lot of people struggle where they want to put an else statement here. They're like, I need an else statement. You don't need an else statement. You only need an else statement if you're going to do something different when they have a GPA that is greater than or equal to 2.5. But in this case, that's all there is to that if statement. I check if it's less than 2.5, and I do a print if I need to. All right, and so now separately, we're also supposed to tell them whether they're going to be here for a while or whether they're almost done. So in this case, we are going to say if the class answer is equal, and remember, this is a string, so I have to use dot equals to freshman. All right, now they could be freshmen or sophomores. So first off, I'm going to make that equals ignore case because, again, I want it to work whether they type in freshman with a capital F or lowercase f or any other combination. But then if they are a freshman or a sophomore, all right, so if they're a freshman or a sophomore, then we're going to do one thing. And I can't tell if there's a semicolon there because this window's in the way. Let's see if I can move that. There we go. Okay. All right. It'll put me back over here where I belong. All right. So if they're, and I don't know why I put a semicolon. I meant to put a curly brace. Yikes. All right. There we go. So if they're a freshman or a sophomore, and by the way, it is possible to just put that on a separate line like that, just to make that a little bit easier to read. You can see I was struggling because it was so long. So if you want to do that, you can put it on another line. Just remember that there has to be two opening parentheses, one, goodness, what is happening? One that is for, all right, there's one opening parenthesis, this class ignore or class answer equals ignore case freshman, or class answer equals ignore case sophomore. this closing parenthesis right here matches the opening parenthesis over here. So that should be correct at this point. All right, so now that we have decided whether or not they are a freshman or sophomore, we're supposed to say system.out.println, you have a while to go yet, or whatever it is that we're supposed to print out. Now this one does have an else condition, because in this case, the else condition is that they are a junior or senior. So in that case, we were told that we were supposed to tell them you are almost done. All right, so this is a case where we had one if statement that has no else, that's to do with one thing, and then we had an if-else statement, which it has an else, and it's about something completely different, and the two of them are just one right after another, and that's all perfectly reasonable. It's quite common that you're going to have circumstances like this where there's more than one if statement in your code. They may be checking different things, and so therefore they're separate if statements. All right, so let's see if this all compiles, and then we're going to give it a try. Okay, looks like it does. So I'm a sophomore, and my GPA is 2.1. It says you could use some improvement and you have a while to go. So I got both of them in that case because I said I was a sophomore and I was 2.5. This time I'm just going to say I'm a senior and I have a 4.0. And we should only say it should only say you are almost done. Oops. All right, just says you are almost done, and I don't get the notice about the GPA needing improvement because that only happens if it's less than 2.5. So again, it's common that you will have more than one if statement. It's common that some if statements will have an else, and it's also common that some if statements will not have an else. It just depends on what you're trying to do. All right, so don't feel like you always have to put else's in there, and don't feel like there can only be one if statement in there. All right, and so the code for that, again, is in the slides, give or take. That should be pretty similar to what I just wrote. And there we go. All right, so now we're going to do another problem. And in this case, what we're doing is we're going to write some software for a fast food restaurant. Ask the user if they want a sandwich or a meal. If they want a meal, they get the sandwich, fries, and a drink. If they say that they only want the sandwich, then you will ask them if they want to buy a drink, and then you tell them what it is that they're getting. So I'm going to create another new replit over here. And so again, there's multiple different conditions here. But the thing that's unique about this is that I'm only going to ask them if they want to buy a drink if I don't already know that they're getting a drink. So the first thing I'm checking is if they're getting the meal or if they're just getting the sandwich. If they're getting the meal, I don't need to do anything because they're already getting a drink. I just tell them, great, you're getting the sandwich, the fries, and the drink. But if they don't choose the meal, if they're only choosing the sandwich, then in that case, I do want to ask them because they might want just a drink instead of wanting the drink and fries. So the usual thing here, import Java util scanner, and I'm going to make a new scanner. It seems like we do this at the beginning of every one. Oop. All right, and so we're supposed to ask, do you want... let's see, am I going to do this as a menu or am I going to do this as individual questions? I'm going to do it as a menu. All right, the code is in the next slide, so you can certainly skip ahead. All right, so what are we buying today? So let's look at how a menu would look like. So we ask the question, and then we're going to have a print statement. And we're going to ask 1 meal and 2 just sandwich. All right, so now we're going to read in their response to that. And so I'm going to store their response in a variable that is of type integer because they're going to answer with an integer most likely. So we're going to say int meal choice is equal to myscan.next int. All right, so if they got a meal, so if the meal choice is 1, then they get a sandwich, fries, and a drink. If the meal choice is not 1, so else, which means that they chose 2, then in this case, I'm now going to ask them if they want to drink. Okay, so notice that this print statement is only going to happen if they didn't choose number 1. I'm going to read in their answer. I was going to give them a menu here again, so system.out.println 1 yes, 2 for no, just so that they're consistently doing numbers. All right, and I'm going to read that in as next int. Okay, so if their want drink is 1, then we're going to say you get a sandwich and a drink. In the other case, so else, we're going to print out you just get a sandwich. Okay, so the important part of this is, notice that I did something very different than the last example. In the last example, I had an if, and then I had an if-else, and they were next to each other, and they were at the same level. But in this case, I am actually doing an if statement inside another if statement. This if statement down here is actually inside of this else up here, meaning it will only happen, it will only do that if statement if their choice originally was not 1. If their choice was 1, we don't ask the question. So when we run this code, what we're going to see is it's going to ask me, do they want a sandwich, or do they want a meal? And I'm going to say that they get a meal, and it says, great, they get a sandwich, fries, and a drink, and it stops. There's no further questions, there's no more work. But now I'm going to run it again, and this time I'm going to choose number 2. And what's going to be different for number 2 is it then asks me a whole new question. Do they want a drink? And I'm going to say yes. So they get a sandwich and a drink. And if I'd said no, they just get a sandwich. So this is the circumstance of what's called a nested if. You'll notice a couple of things about how I wrote this. When I put this second if down here inside of the other if, notice that it is indented at the same level as all the other code that's in the else. And then notice that its code, its block of statements that wanted to be executed if it's 1 or 2, they're even further indented. And this is a way to make it clear to somebody looking at this that this else begins and ends here because that's where the curly braces are. This else begins and ends here because that's where the curly braces are. And this if begins and ends here. So it's just a way of making it so that it's visually appealing to somebody who looks at it, so that they understand that all of this code, including the subsequent if, are only going to happen when you're in this else condition. They're all related to this else condition. And likewise, this code is the code that's related to the if condition. All right, so very important that you lay it out in a neat, orderly way like this so that anybody who looks at your code can understand which things are inside of which other things and which things are not inside of which other things. So there we go, that's the example here, and that seems to work. This is a nested if statement where I have an if inside of another if. And again, the answer that I just typed in, or something very similar to it, is right here in the slides. And so you can go back and look at that again after the fact. All right, so that brings us to an even bigger, more complex example. So if you've ever been to a restaurant that has a Coke Freestyle machine, that's the big machine where you choose on the touchscreen what it is that you want. And generally, the first thing you do is you choose the basic flavor that you want, and then you choose the add-ons to that flavor. And so, like, you can start off with regular Coke, and you can add cherry to it, and then you get cherry Coke. Or you can start off with Diet Coke, and you can add orange to it, and you would get Diet Orange Coke, and so on and so on and so forth. So there's 2 complete steps there. The first step, it asks you the high level, what basic flavor are you using? Is it Coke, Sprite, Fanta, Diet Coke, etc.? And then it secondly asks you for a choice of flavor that you want to add to it. And the flavors are dependent. You can't do some combinations. So for example, with Fanta, if you're getting orange Fanta, I don't think you can add orange to it because that doesn't make any sense. But maybe you can add vanilla to orange Fanta. Who knows? So these are a case where you're going to prompt the user for the first choice, and then you're going to ask them for their add-on flavors that they might want to do on that. So I'm not going to type this one up because it's just a much longer example, and you'll watch me do piles of typos, which isn't particularly helpful, but I am going to walk through it so that you can see what's happening in here. So the first thing that's going on is, of course, the usual, we import a scanner and we make the usual scanner. That's nothing particularly weird. I'm creating a variable called drink choice, and I'm setting it equal to empty string. And I'm just doing that so that I have a variable that I'm then going to be able to ask them about. Or that I'm going to be able to use to fill in their final drink flavor. All right, so then our first menu is going to print out what base flavor do you want. So that's just a bunch of print statements. It looks like it's about 4 or 5 print statements. And then we're finally going to read in a next int here, which is going to store in a base flavor a number. If it's 1, we know it's Coke. If it's 2, we know it's Coke Zero. If it's 3, it's Fanta, and so on and so forth. All right. So then we have a block of code that deals with the circumstance where they're asking for Coke. And this block actually begins and ends here. So it's all of the code that I effectively highlighted. So if base flavor is equal to 1, which is Coke, then we're going to ask, okay, you're getting a Coke, what flavor? And you have a choice of regular, cherry, or vanilla. And it's again going to read in another variable. This time we're calling it add-on flavor, and we're storing that variable inside of add-on flavor. Then we're using a nested if. This if statement is actually inside the other if statement, right? So now we are checking the add-on flavor to decide which particular one they wanted. And if they wanted 1, then they're getting regular Coke. If they wanted 2, they're getting cherry Coke. If they wanted 3, they're getting vanilla Coke, and so on and so forth. That all is part of base flavor equal 1. Completely separately, we then have a whole other menu that deals with base flavor equals 2. And in that case, we ask them, okay, you're getting a Coke Zero, what flavor, what, and again, we're giving them regular, cherry, and vanilla. Maybe there's different choices for Coke Zero, I don't know. So it's possible that you could have a different set of choices in here, but I just went with the same ones for this example. And again, there'll be a nested if statement, which starts there and continues down to here, that is checking which particular add-on that they're getting to their cherry or to their Coke Zero. And then you would likewise have another one for case 3 of the base flavors, which was the circumstance where they chose Sprite, and you'd also want one for the case where they chose Fanta. And I didn't write all those out because we would just run out of room on the slide, but effectively you'd have a very similar circumstance to what's happening with 1, where you would print out another menu of the available choices, let them choose from that menu, and then tell them what their particular flavor is. And the reason that we used an else at the end of all of this is because, well, if it wasn't Coke, and it wasn't Coke Zero, and it wasn't Sprite, then we're presuming that the answer is Fanta. And again, by doing an else, we're making it so that if you type in 5, you get Fanta. And then at the very end, after all those if statements, we tell them what their drink choice was. And that was the variable that was a string that was declared up here, and it was changed in each one of the inner if statements. So this again is an example of an if that has a bunch of if statements in it. And it is possible that you could have more than one if statement inside another if statement. It's possible that you could have if statements inside of if statements inside of if statements. This can go as deep and as nested as it needs to, depending on the circumstance. So the point of all of this example is to talk through that you can absolutely have an if statement inside another if statement. The previous example that we looked at when we were back here on the earlier version of this. Okay, there we go. Let me move. Okay. In this earlier example that we were looking at, in this earlier example, we had 2 if statements that were next to each other. The first if statement, which is the part that I'm highlighting here, that is completely separate and independent from this. They are not inside each other. This if statement over here is independent and separate from this statement over here because they're not inside one another. The one that I'm highlighting in yellow down here, let's see, that's not coming out very clearly. Let's see, can I get a better pen? I cannot. All right, I can put stickers on there. How about that? All right. The one with the smiley face is a completely separate and independent one from the one with the hearts. They have nothing to do with each other. The one with the smiley face has a single if, it has no else, and then the one that has the hearts is an if else, and it is completely separate and independent. One is not inside the other. And that's true for these, but when we get further on to this more complex one that we just did, it is the case that the inner if statements, which are these guys. Oh, yellow is a terrible choice. Let's not do that. Let's try blue. Hey, there we go. All right, so the inner if statement is inside an outer if statement. And likewise, this inner if statement, which comes from here to here, the bits that are circled there, they are both inside that if. Oops, that's not where I meant to draw that line. Okay, let's try this again. This if statement is inside of that if statement. All right, so they are not independent, they are not separate, they are related. You only get the inner one, the one with the hearts, only ever happens when the one with the sunglasses is true. We will only see the one with the hearts if the one with the sunglasses has happened. So definitely keep that in mind, that it is two separate, independent ways that you can do if statements. In one case, one is inside the other. In the other case, they're just two separate if statements. So then you might wonder, could you always convert nested if statements into a big complex set of single if statements? And the answer is often you could, but it'll make more sense to do one thing or another. And what I mean by that is sometimes when you'll think about a problem, you will solve it by making an if statement and putting another if statement inside of it, and that will make logical sense in your head. Other times when you think about a problem, you'll solve it as a single big long if statement that each condition, each else if, has, multiple different things that it's testing. If this is true and that's true, or this is true or that's true, then do this. If this is true or that's true, then do that. If this is true or that's true, then do that. So you will find that one of those is going to make more sense to you, and it usually comes down to you'll want them to be nested if the second decision that you're trying to make is related and dependent on the first decision. Then you'll want nested, meaning one if inside of another if. You'll want them to be separate if the two things are unrelated most of the time. So just think through that. It's not always going to be the case. It is often the case that you're going to have if statements that could be solved either way. And so this is just a general set of rules as to how you would go about doing something. All right, so ask the user their grade in the class. If their grade is below 90, ask them if they have been to tutoring and live help. If they have not, suggest that they use it more. All right, so we're going to break this down into two separate parts here. The first part is we're going to ask the user for their grade in the class. That's the first statement. And then we're then going to check and see if the grade is below 90. If it is below 90, and only if it's below 90, then we're going to have a new if statement where we're going to ask if they've been to tutoring. And again, if they have not, then we're going to suggest something more. So it seems to me like these are two separate statements. There's the statement that asks about their grade, and then there's a separate statement that asks about their tutoring. But we're only going to ask the tutoring question if their grade in the class is below 90. So that sounds to me like the two of these are going to be nested. The second if statement is going to be inside of the first one, because we're only going to ask if they've been to tutoring if their grade is also below 90. All right, so let's take a look at coding this one up. So I'm going to start a new replet, and I'm just going to put in the scanner, and I'm going to pause while I do that so you don't have to watch me. Okay, so now we have a new replet, and I have made a usual scanner just so to save time. All right, so the first thing that we were supposed to do was we were to ask the user, what is your grade in the class? And then we're going to read in their grade. So what type should the grade be? Well, it's going to be a number, certainly, but they could have an 89.2, so probably needs to be a float or a double. So float, student grade is equal to myscan.nextFloat. All right, and so that reads in their float. Now, we're going to say if that grade is less than 90, then we're going to ask, have they been to tutoring? So this is inside that if. We're only asking it if their grade is less than 90. All right, and now we need to read in their answer again. So we're going to store that in a string. I'm going to tell them to answer that with a yes or no. All right. So going to read that in as a string. This is going to cause a weird problem, but we'll get to it in a second. All right, so string tutoring equals myscan.nextLine. All right, and then if tutoring is less than 90, then we're supposed to tell them they should use it more. You should go to tutoring. Okay, so this is not going to work, and I'll explain why in just a moment, but let's focus first on the if statement. I'm first checking if their grade is less than 90. Only if their grade is less than 90 do I do all of this stuff. If their grade is above 90, I will actually do nothing. The program will just end. So we have to check if that's what it asks for. And it says, ask the user what their grade is in the class. If their grade is below 90, ask them if they've been to tutoring. If they have not, suggest they use it more. So it's not telling me to do anything if they have a grade above 90. So this is very reasonable that I don't know why I typed that. If tutoring is equals to y, and again, that should probably be equals ignore case to y, then we're going to say you should go to tutoring more. Sorry, if it's n, we should say you should go to tutoring more. All right, so sorry about that. All right, so we have an if statement where we check their grade. If their grade is less than 90, we're going to do these other things. One of the things that we're going to happen to do is an if statement. This is an if statement that is nested inside another if statement. Notice that neither of these if statements have an else, because I was never told to do anything with an else in any of those cases, so I'm not going to put them in there. If their grade is greater than 90, the program's just going to end. If their grade is less than 90, but they have been going to tutoring, the program's just going to end. It's not going to ask them any further questions. But if it's less than 90 and they're not going to tutoring, then it's going to tell them you need to go to tutoring more, at least in theory. All right, so I'm going to run this, and when I run this, it's not going to work correctly. It's going to ask successfully for the grade, and it's going to read in the grade, and then it's just immediately going to end. All right, so when it was a 90, that was what was supposed to happen. I was supposed to get nothing there. But now if I run it again and I give them a grade less than 90, it is supposed to ask me if they've been going to tutoring, but it's not going to do that. So they have a 70. It just immediately ends. And that's a weird bug in Java. And I'm just going to briefly explain this because you will run into it in your program. If you are only ever doing next lines, you won't have this problem. If you're only doing next ints or next floats, you won't have this problem. You will only have this problem if you do a number like next int, next float, next double, followed by a next line. When you do that, you're going to have a problem where the next line seems to just get skipped over, and you can see that's what happened here. It printed out, have you been to tutoring? Yes, no, but it never stopped and waited for me to type in an answer. And the reason is because this line effectively got skipped. And this happens in Java because of when it reads in next float, what the user actually typed in here was 70, and they hit the enter key. The next float read the 70, but it doesn't care about the enter key because that's not part of a float. So it leaves the enter key sitting in a buffer such that when it gets to this line and it then tries to read in the next line, there's an enter key in there, so it assumes that the answer was an empty string. This is a weird Java thing that happens only in the case where you have next int, next float, next double, next short, next long, followed by next line. If you're doing a number followed by a next line, you will run into this problem. The solution is to just do a myscan.nextLine immediately after you do the next float. You're not even assigning it to a variable. This is just to deal with the extra enter key. And I know that's really weird and really non-intuitive, and I'm really sorry. I wish I could just fix this. But every time that you do a number and then try to do a line, you're just going to need to remember to put in an extra next line in there. Now the program's going to work correctly. It's going to ask me for a number. I'm going to type in that number, so 70. Then it's going to ask, have I been to tutoring? I'm going to say no, and it says you should go to tutoring more, like it's supposed to. All right, so ignoring that weirdness of reading numbers followed by next lines, getting back to the original point of this example, this is an if statement that has another if statement inside of it. It understands that the code that's supposed to be run for this if statement is what's in between those curly braces, and it understands that the code that will be run for this if statement is in between those curly braces, and it just happens that another if statement is inside of there, and it's okay with that. So when you deal with circumstances like this, where you have an if inside of an if, it seems confusing at first, but it really isn't. It's just an if statement that happens to be inside of an if statement. So this is a perfectly valid solution to this problem. I will point out that you could do this without the nested if statement, and that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to leave this if statement in here, but I'm going to do it the other way. So what would happen in the other solution is I would ask the first question, and then I would use a more complex if statement to decide. This is not in exactly the same program, because this will ask whether you've been to tutoring or not, regardless of your grade. But then it will process it kind of similarly. All right, so I'm going to comment out the original solution, which is probably the right answer, but I just want you to be aware that you could do this a different way. It's often the case when people watch me code, they think this is the only possible way it could be solved, and that's not true. There are many ways you could do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the two lines where I asked them about tutoring, and I'm going to leave them outside of the if statement. And what I mean by that is I'm going to ask them these questions no matter what. And copy paste is not working today because reasons. All right, copy. Oh, there it is. And now we pasted it twice. Awesome. All right. So I'm going to just tidy that back up again. And there we have it. Now, I'm going to write one big if statement that covers both of the circumstances. So if the grade is less than 90 and tutoring dot equals ignore case no, then in that case, I'm going to tell them you should go to tutoring more. So what I'm doing is I'm making a more complex, it's not called grade, it's called student grade. That's why that's underlined. I'm making a more complex if statement that has an and condition in there, and I'm dealing with all of it in one case. So if I run this code, bear in mind that this is all commented out, which means the computer is ignoring all of that code. I'm getting, please enter your grade in the class, so I'm going to say that I have a 70. And now it's going to ask me, have you been to tutoring, yes or no? And I'm going to say no, and you can see it still says you should go to tutoring more. I've combined the original outer if and the inner if into a single if. But in order to make this work, the downside of this solution is that it will always ask if I've been to tutoring. So if I say that I have 100 in the class, it's then going to ask, have you been to tutoring? And I'm going to say no, and the program's going to end. It actually isn't going to do anything with this tutoring. No matter what I say to that, this if statement is never going to be true, because once this was false, with an and, I have no idea what just happened. With an and condition, if either side of it is false, it's impossible for the whole thing to be true. So therefore it knew, because my grade was 100, that it was never going to have to evaluate this. So it's kind of wasteful to ask them this question and then not pay attention to it. It's kind of like that friend who asks you incessant questions and isn't paying attention to you as you're giving them the answer. So it is possible to solve this many different ways. What's in the commented out area is probably the better solution because it is specific to what the question asked. It's asking for a GPA, then it's reading in the float. If it's below 90, and only if it's below 90, it's asking about tutoring, and then it's telling them whether or not they need to go. No matter what, you will notice that there was no else condition in any of this. I just use if conditions here, and that again is to reiterate that you don't always have else conditions as you're writing ifs. So that completes the second lecture on conditionals. If statements are a big, long topic because there's lots of different things you can do with them. You can use them to check one simple thing or multiple things when you add ands and ors and maybe nots in there. So you could have 2 or 3 different conditions that need to be true. You can have an if statement and then an else. You can have an if statement without an else. You can have an if statement with an else if without an else, or an if statement with an else if with an else, or an if statement with an else if and then an else, or an if statement with an else if, and no else. So all of those are possible, and any number of else ifs is possible in there. So that completes our section on conditionals. There is one other type of conditional, which I'll just briefly mention at the very end here, which is called a switch statement. It's not going to be covered in this class. It's something you're going to see when you get to 1321 if you continue on down that path. But there is another way of doing this. If statements can do everything that a switch statement does, so that's why we only show if statements in this class. But just in case you Google it and you're like, he never told us about that one, it's because, well, it's not covered in this class. So I will see you guys in the next class. You guys take care.